The crystal chandeliers of Lady Pembroke's ballroom cast 1,000 dancing lights across the silk and satin gowns that swirled below, the sweet strains of a waltz floating through the perfumed air on this warm April evening of 1815. Margaret Ashford stood in her customary position near the potted palms, her modest grey silk dress marking her as clearly as any sign might have done. Here stands the spinster, the wallflower, the woman whom society had deemed past her prime at the advanced age of 28. She had long since ceased expecting anyone to request her hand for a dance, had learned to find a sort of melancholy contentment in observing the glittering pageant before her, though her fingers still sometimes twitched with the desire to move to the music. Tonight, however, her attention was caught by the arrival of Alexander Montague, Duke of Westford, his tall frame cutting an impressive figure in his perfectly tailored dark blue coat as he moved through the crowd with the natural authority of his rank. Margaret had heard the whispers, of course. Everyone in London knew that the Duke was in desperate need of a wealthy bride to save his crumbling estates, though he carried himself with such aristocratic pride that one might never guess at the financial storms brewing behind those cool grey eyes. She watched as her cousin Catherine Beaumont immediately manoeuvred herself into his path, her golden curls catching the light as she dropped into a perfect curtsy, her low-cut rose gown displaying her considerable charms to their best advantage. The Duke bowed politely, but Margaret noticed how his gaze swept the room even as he spoke to Catherine, clearly cataloguing the young ladies present like a merchant evaluating goods at market. A bitter taste filled Margaret's mouth as she pressed herself deeper into the shadows, knowing that his assessment would never include her. Plain Margaret Ashford, with her modest dowry and unremarkable brown hair, whose father had been merely a country gentleman, and whose mother had committed the unforgivable sin of dying too young to properly launch her daughter into society. What the Duke did not know, what no one in this glittering assembly knew save for her faithful solicitor, Mr. Fleming, was that Margaret's merchant grandfather had left her a fortune in London property that would make even the wealthiest peer's eyes widen with amazement. But she had learned long ago that revealing such information would only bring fortune hunters to her door. Men who would see only the gleam of gold and never the woman herself. Better to remain invisible, she had decided, than to be wanted only for what she possessed rather than who she was. The music swelled, and couples began to take their positions for the next dance, but Margaret remained in her corner, unaware that the evening she had expected to pass, like so many others, would soon transform into something that would shake the very foundations of London society. Now, please take a moment and subscribe to our channel and comment where you are watching from and what time is it. It is always fascinating to see where these stories get all around the world. Thank you. The clock had just chimed 10 when Margaret decided she had endured quite enough of the evening's humiliations and began making her way toward the refreshment room, hoping to find a quiet moment before ordering her carriage. But as she passed behind a cluster of gentlemen gathered near the card-room entrance, she heard the Duke of Westford's distinctive baritone cutting through their laughter with words that made her freeze in place. "The matrimonial market this season is particularly dismal," he was saying, his tone dripping with aristocratic disdain. "Miss Pembroke brings barely £5,000. The Wetherby chit perhaps 8,000, if one includes her mother's jewels. And as for the others lurking about the edges of the ballroom, well, one might as well marry a shopkeeper's daughter for all the good their pittances would do." The men laughed, and Margaret felt heat rise in her cheeks as one of them mentioned her name specifically, to which the Duke responded with a dismissive wave of his gloved hand. "Miss Ashford, good heavens, Pemberton, have you taken leave of your senses? The woman must be nearing 30, plain as a pikestaff, and what could she possibly bring to a marriage besides her tedious respectability, and perhaps £2,000 if one is being generous?" The casual cruelty of his assessment struck Margaret like a physical blow, years of carefully maintained composure crumbling as something fierce and rebellious ignited within her chest. And before she could think better of it, she stepped around the pillar that had concealed her presence and fixed the Duke with a steady gaze that made the laughter die on the men's lips. "Your Grace," she said, her voice carrying with surprising clarity across the sudden hush that had fallen over their corner of the ballroom, "I find it fascinating that you presume to know so much about the financial circumstances of ladies to whom you have never been properly introduced, though I suppose desperation does tend to make one rather free with one's assumptions." The Duke turned slowly, his grey eyes widening slightly as he took in her presence, clearly calculating how much she might have overheard. But Margaret was far past caring about propriety or the consequences of her words as she continued, "Since you seem so very interested in the monetary value of your potential brides, perhaps you would like to know that your estimation of my worth is off by a factor that would likely strain even your ducal ability at arithmetic." The crowd around them began to grow as other guests sensed the delicious tension of scandal brewing. Catherine pushing her way to the front with barely concealed glee at what she assumed would be her cousin's social destruction, but Margaret felt strangely liberated as she met the Duke's increasingly wary gaze and delivered the words that would echo through London's drawing rooms for weeks to come. "I own half of London, Your Grace, from the docks at Wapping to the finest squares in Mayfair, a fortune in property that generates more in monthly rents than your estates have seen in years. But please, do continue explaining how my £2,000 and plain face make me unworthy of consideration." The silence that followed was absolute, the Duke's face draining of colour as the implications of her declaration sank in, the music from the ballroom seeming to pause as if the very orchestra had sensed the seismic shift occurring in their midst. And Margaret, having lit the fuse of social explosion, dropped a perfect curtsy and swept from the room, leaving Alexander Montague, Duke of Westford, standing frozen among his peers, his world tilted entirely off its axis by a woman he had dismissed without a second thought. The rain that had threatened throughout the night finally arrived with the dawn, drumming against the windows of Margaret Ashford's modest townhouse in Russell Square as she sat at her breakfast table, still wearing her morning dress of soft lavender muslin, her hands wrapped around a cup of rapidly cooling tea while she stared at the morning post that her butler had just delivered, though she found herself unable to focus on the correspondence as her mind kept returning to the events of the previous evening at Lady Pembroke's ball. She had barely slept, alternating between fierce pride at having finally stood up to the casual cruelty of society and a creeping horror at what she had done, revealing the secret she had guarded so carefully for years in a moment of wounded fury. And now all of London would know that plain, overlooked Margaret Ashford was actually one of the wealthiest women in England. The sound of carriages on the wet cobblestones outside drew her attention, an unusual amount of traffic for this quiet square at 10 in the morning, and her housekeeper Mrs. Pritchard appeared in the doorway with an expression of barely contained excitement, announcing that Lady Harriet Montague had called and was waiting in the morning room, which made Margaret's stomach drop as she realized that the Duke of Westford's own sister had come to her home, though whether to condemn or congratulate she could not guess. Rising on unsteady legs, Margaret smoothed her simple morning dress and made her way to the morning room, where she found a young woman of perhaps 22 years perched on the edge of the sofa, her bright hazel eyes sparkling with what appeared to be delight rather than censure. And before Margaret could even offer a proper greeting, Lady Harriet burst out, "Miss Ashford, I simply had to come and tell you how absolutely magnificent you were last night. The way you put my brother in his place was the most thrilling thing I have witnessed in years, and I do hope we can be friends because any woman who can render Alexander speechless is someone I desperately want to know better." Margaret sank into a chair, quite overwhelmed by this unexpected enthusiasm, as Lady Harriet continued, "You must understand, I love my brother dearly, but he has become so insufferably proud since inheriting the title, acting as though his noble blood makes him superior to everyone else when the truth is our estates are falling apart, and he refuses to consider any practical solutions that might wound his precious dignity." The steady stream of callers that followed Lady Harriet's departure left Margaret's head spinning. Some came to gawk at the newly revealed heiress, others to suddenly remember long-dormant connections to her family, and a few brave merchants' wives to express their admiration for one of their own who had risen so high. But through it all, Margaret found herself thinking of grey eyes wide with shock, and wondering what the Duke of Westford was thinking this rain-soaked morning after his world had been so thoroughly shaken to. The spring sunshine that filtered through the tall windows of his study did nothing to warm the cold knot of anxiety that had taken residence in Alexander Montague's chest since that catastrophic evening at Lady Pembroke's ball 2 days prior, and as he sat behind his mahogany desk at precisely 2 in the afternoon, surrounded by ledgers and correspondence that all seemed to mock him with their tales of mounting debts and dwindling resources, he found himself staring at the single sheet of paper his man of business, Mr. Hartley, had just placed before him with hands that trembled slightly. "Your Grace," Hartley was saying, his usually composed voice carrying a note of awe that Alexander had never heard before, "I have made the inquiries you requested regarding Miss Margaret Ashford's claims, and I must confess that what I have discovered defies all reasonable expectation." The older man adjusted his spectacles and continued, "Miss Ashford inherited from her maternal grandfather one Josiah Blackwood, who was indeed a merchant, but of such spectacular success that he managed to acquire property throughout London during the financial panics of the last century, when aristocratic families were forced to sell, and his acquisitions were nothing short of genius in their selection." Alexander felt his throat constrict as Hartley began listing the properties. Entire streets in Bloomsbury, warehouses along the Thames, shops in Bond Street, residential squares in Mayfair, even the very building that housed his own bank, and with each addition to the inventory, the Duke felt his carefully constructed worldview crumbling like ancient parchment exposed to flame. "The annual income from these holdings," Hartley continued, his voice now barely above a whisper, as if speaking the numbers too loudly might somehow make them less real, "exceeds £5,000 per year, Your Grace, making Miss Ashford one of the wealthiest individuals in England, regardless of gender or social standing." The implications crashed over Alexander like a tide, not merely the staggering wealth itself, but the realization that this woman he had dismissed so carelessly, whose worth he had reduced to a pittance while laughing with his peers, had sat quietly in ballrooms for years knowing she could buy and sell half the ton without blinking. And the shame that coursed through him was unlike anything he had experienced in his privileged life. Furthermore, Hartley added, seemingly unaware of his employer's internal turmoil, "Miss Ashford manages these properties herself, having been educated by her grandfather in matters of business and finance, and my sources indicate she makes all decisions personally, visiting her properties regularly and maintaining relationships with her tenants that have resulted in extraordinary loyalty and profit." Alexander rose abruptly from his chair and moved to the window, staring out at the manicured gardens of his London residence, while his mind raced with memories of Margaret Ashford's quiet dignity, the intelligence that had flashed in her eyes when she had confronted him, the strength it must have taken to hide such wealth while enduring the slights and dismissals of society, and he realized with crushing clarity that he had been the fool in their encounter, not she, and that his own desperate circumstances had blinded him to everything of real value, reducing his vision to mere pounds and shillings when true worth stood before him unrecognized. The cherry blossoms in Hyde Park were at their peak bloom on the morning of April 20th, 5 days after that fateful ball at Lady Pembroke's, creating a canopy of delicate pink petals that drifted like snow with each gentle breeze at precisely 11 o'clock, when Margaret Ashford found herself walking along the serpentine path. Having agreed to this meeting against her better judgment, after receiving a carefully worded note from the Duke of Westford requesting the honour of a private conversation. She had chosen her walking dress with particular care, a deep blue pelisse over a cream muslin gown that emphasized her neat figure while maintaining perfect propriety. And as she spotted his tall form waiting beneath a particularly magnificent cherry tree, she steeled herself for what she assumed would be either a mercenary proposal or perhaps threats regarding her revelations about his character. Alexander Montague stood with his back to her, his broad shoulders tense beneath his perfectly tailored coat of bottle green superfine, and when he turned at the sound of her approaching footsteps, she was startled to see that his usual expression of aristocratic hauteur had been replaced by something she had never witnessed before. Genuine humility mixed with what appeared to be sincere regret. "Miss Ashford," he began, bowing more deeply than their relative social positions required, "I am grateful beyond measure that you agreed to meet me, though I am painfully aware that I deserve no such consideration after my unconscionable behaviour at Lady Pembroke's ball." Margaret inclined her head slightly, waiting in silence as he visibly struggled to find his next words, a struggle that would have amused her had she not been so acutely aware of her own racing heartbeat and the way the morning light caught the silver threads in his dark hair. "I have come to offer you an apology," he continued, his grey eyes meeting hers directly. "Not because society now knows of your wealth, for that would be the basest form of hypocrisy, but because I have spent these past days reflecting on my conduct and finding myself utterly wanting in every measure of decent behaviour." The sincerity in his voice caught her off guard, and she found herself studying his face for signs of deception, but saw only a man wrestling with genuine shame. "Your Grace," she replied carefully, "I appreciate your words, though I confess to some puzzlement as to why you felt compelled to seek me out for this purpose, as we have no connection beyond that unfortunate evening." He gestured to a nearby bench, and after a moment's hesitation, she settled herself upon it, acutely conscious of the propriety of their meeting in such a public place where numerous other fashionable people strolled, though none close enough to overhear their conversation. "Miss Ashford, may I speak plainly?" he asked, taking a seat at a proper distance from her, and at her nod, he continued, "I have discovered through careful inquiry not merely the extent of your holdings, which are indeed as vast as you claimed, but more importantly, I have learned of your remarkable acumen in managing them, your fair treatment of your tenants, your charitable works done without fanfare, and your extraordinary education in matters of business that would put most men of commerce to shame. And I find myself forced to confront the ugly truth that I dismissed you based on the shallowest possible criteria, while remaining blind to qualities of genuine worth that were evident to anyone who bothered to truly look." The formal dinner party at Lord and Lady Beaumont's residence on the evening of April 25th was precisely the sort of glittering affair that Margaret Ashford had attended countless times as an overlooked guest. But tonight, 10 days after her dramatic revelation at Lady Pembroke's ball, she entered the candlelit dining room with a newfound confidence that made several heads turn, including that of the Duke of Westford, who found himself unable to look away from her elegant figure dressed in deep emerald silk that brought out the hidden fire in her brown eyes. Lady Harriet Montague, who had become an unexpected ally and friend over the past week, immediately drew Margaret into conversation with a group of influential merchants and their wives, and it was here that Alexander witnessed something that thoroughly captivated him. Margaret's extraordinary mind at work as she discussed the implications of the Corn Laws on London property values with such insight and authority that Lord Pemberton, one of the most successful traders in the city, hung on her every word. "Miss Ashford," Lord Pemberton was saying with evident respect, "your analysis of the dock expansion's effect on eastern property values is remarkably astute, though I wonder if you have considered the impact of the proposed canal system on transport costs." To which Margaret replied with a slight smile, "Indeed, Lord Pemberton, I have not merely considered it, but have already acquired 3 warehouses along the proposed route, as I believe the reduction in transport costs will increase their value by at least 40% within 2 years. Alexander watched from across the room as Margaret continued to hold court, her quiet authority commanding attention from men who would have dismissed her entirely just weeks before, and he found himself profoundly moved by the graceful way she wielded her knowledge without arrogance, offering insights that were both brilliant and practical while maintaining perfect social decorum. When the conversation turned to the recent bank failures, Margaret's cousin Catherine attempted to redirect attention to herself with vapid comments about the inconvenience to her shopping, but Margaret smoothly continued her discussion, explaining the liquidity crisis with such clarity that even Catherine's mother, Lady Beaumont, leaned in to listen, and Alexander realized he was witnessing not just intelligence, but a form of power he had never encountered in a woman of society. "Your sister speaks very highly of Miss Ashford's business acumen," Lord Greville commented quietly to Alexander as they observed the scene. "And I must say, after hearing her thoughts on diversification of investment portfolios, I am considering consulting with her regarding my own holdings." A statement that would have seemed absurd mere days ago, but now felt entirely natural. During the dinner itself, Margaret was seated between a pompous member of Parliament and an elderly viscount, who initially attempted to patronize her with discussions of weather and fashion. But within minutes she had steered the conversation toward the proposed factory acts, demonstrating such comprehensive understanding of both the economic and humanitarian implications that the MP found himself furiously taking mental notes while the Viscount listened with growing admiration, and Alexander, watching from his place further down the table, felt an unfamiliar warmth spreading through his chest that had nothing to do with the excellent wine and everything to do with the remarkable woman who had hidden such brilliance behind a facade of quiet propriety for so many years. The May Day Fair in Greenwich Park buzzed with festive energy on that bright afternoon of May 1st, 2 weeks after the revelations at Lady Pembroke's ball, with colourful ribbons streaming from the maypole, while children darted between stalls, selling sweetmeats and spring flowers, creating a scene of pastoral celebration that seemed far removed from the rigid constraints of London society, though Margaret Ashford knew that even here, among the Morris dancers and flower sellers, the whispers followed her like shadows cast by the afternoon sun. She had come with Lady Harriet Montague and a small party of friends, determined to enjoy the traditional festivities despite the increasingly vicious rumours that her cousin Catherine had been spreading with calculated malice throughout every drawing-room in Mayfair, tales that grew more elaborate with each telling about Margaret's grandfather's supposedly scandalous origins, and questioning how a mere merchant's granddaughter dared to move in their elevated circles. Alexander Montague arrived at the fair separately, ostensibly to escort his sister, but finding his gaze drawn repeatedly to Margaret, as she stood admiring a display of spring blooms, the simple sprigged muslin of her dress, and the way the sunshine caught the auburn highlights in her brown hair, making her appear more approachable and genuinely lovely than any of the perfectly coiffed ladies who surrounded them, and he felt that now familiar tightening in his chest that he had been desperately trying to ignore. The trouble began when Lady Pemberton, one of society's most influential gossips, approached their group with Catherine Beaumont on her arm, both women wearing expressions of barely concealed malice as Catherine spoke in carrying tones. "How charming to see you enjoying such common entertainments, cousin Margaret, though I suppose one cannot entirely escape one's origins, no matter how much property one might acquire through trade," her emphasis on the last word dripping with disdain. Margaret's face remained composed, though Alexander saw the slight tremor in her hands as she carefully set down the nosegay she had been examining. And before she could form a response, Lady Pemberton added with false sweetness, "Indeed, Miss Beaumont was just telling me the most fascinating tales about your grandfather's early days in the dockyards. Such colourful stories about his associations with smugglers and worse, though I'm certain there must be some exaggeration in the telling." The gathering crowd of onlookers held their breath, waiting to see how Margaret would respond to this public humiliation. But before she could speak, Alexander stepped forward with controlled fury in every line of his body, his voice cutting through the spring air with ducal authority as he declared, "Lady Pemberton, I find myself curious about your sudden interest in mercantile history, particularly when your own husband's fortune derives from interests in the slave trade that he attempts to hide behind shell companies, a fact that Miss Ashford's grandfather's honest labour in legitimate shipping makes appear all the more shameful by comparison." The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the distant sound of fiddle music from the Morris dancers. As Lady Pemberton's face drained of colour and Catherine's mouth opened and closed soundlessly like a landed fish, while Alexander continued with icy precision. Furthermore, any person of genuine breeding would recognize that Miss Ashford's dedication to the responsible management of her holdings and her charitable works throughout London speaks to a nobility of character that no amount of inherited titles could bestow, and I find myself honoured to be in her company. He then turned to Margaret with a formal bow and offered her his arm with unmistakable intention, saying clearly enough for all to hear, "Miss Ashford, would you do me the honour of viewing the Morris dancing with me, as I find the present company has become insufferably tedious?" And as Margaret placed her trembling hand on his arm, she felt the solid warmth of his support and saw in his grey eyes something that made her heart race with possibilities she had never dared to imagine. The Royal Opera House glowed with thousands of candles on the evening of May 5th, 3 weeks after that fateful ball at Lady Pembroke's, and Margaret Ashford sat in her box wearing an exquisite gown of midnight blue silk that had cost more than most families spent in a year, though she took no joy in the extravagance as she felt the weight of hostile stares and heard the whispers that followed her like a malevolent chorus through the crimson and gold splendour of the theatre. The scandal had broken that very morning in the most vicious way possible, splashed across the gossip sheets with lurid details about her grandfather's supposed criminal connections in his early days at the docks, complete with fabricated accounts of smuggling operations and hints at even darker deeds, all carefully orchestrated by sources that Margaret knew led directly back to her cousin Catherine's drawing room, where jealousy had festered into something truly poisonous. Lady Harriet sat beside her, loyally defiant in her support, but even she could not shield Margaret from the cut direct delivered by Lady Ashworth in the lobby, or the way several matrons had pointedly turned their backs when she entered, and Margaret felt each slight like a physical blow despite her attempts to hold her head high and pretend that the devastating assault on her grandfather's memory meant nothing to her. Alexander arrived late to his family's box directly across from hers, and she saw the moment he registered her presence and the way his jaw tightened as he observed how the occupants of the surrounding boxes were openly staring and whispering, some even pointing with their fans in a display of rudeness that would have been unthinkable toward someone of accepted social standing. The opera began, but Margaret heard none of the beautiful music. Too aware of the continuing scrutiny and the way even the performers on stage seemed to blur through the tears she refused to let fall, and she was contemplating the least conspicuous way to escape when she noticed Alexander rising from his seat with purposeful determination. He crossed the corridor between the boxes in full view of the entire upper tier, each step deliberate and measured, and Margaret's heart nearly stopped when he appeared at the entrance to her box. Bowing formally before addressing her in a voice that carried clearly to every straining ear nearby, "Miss Ashford, Lady Harriet, I wonder if I might join you for the remainder of the first act, as I find the company in my own box has become insufferably dull." The theatre seemed to hold its collective breath, as Margaret nodded her consent and Alexander settled into the chair beside her with perfect composure. And then, in a gesture that sent shockwaves through their audience, he leaned slightly toward her and began quietly explaining the plot of the opera as though they were old friends sharing a pleasant evening, his presence a shield against the hostile stares, and his choice a declaration that resonated far more powerfully than any words. When intermission arrived and Margaret steeled herself for the ordeal of facing society in the crush of the lobby, Alexander rose and offered her his arm with the same natural ease he might have shown to a duchess. And as they proceeded through the crowds with Lady Harriet, his ducal consequence forcing a path through those who would have snubbed Margaret alone, he demonstrated with every gesture and word that he valued her company above society's opinion, choosing her dignity over their approval with a courage that made her throat tight with emotions she dared not name. The steady rain against the windows of Margaret Ashford's private study created a soothing rhythm on the morning of May 10th, nearly a month after the ball that had changed everything. As she sat at her mahogany desk reviewing correspondence from her various property managers, though her mind kept drifting to the events at the opera 5 days prior and the way Alexander Montague had stood by her side against all of society's censure. She had sent him a brief note of thanks the following day, carefully worded and formal, but he had not replied, and she told herself it was foolish to feel disappointed when he had already done more than she had any right to expect from a duke who owed her nothing beyond common courtesy. The knock at her study door came as a surprise, for she had instructed the servants that she was not receiving visitors this morning, needing time to compose herself and attend to business matters that had been neglected during the social whirlwind of recent weeks. But her butler's apologetic expression as he entered suggested something unusual. "Your pardon, Miss Ashford, but His Grace the Duke of Westford insists the matter is urgent and relates to your business interests," he said, and Margaret's pulse quickened as she smoothed her simple morning dress of dove-grey wool and tried to calm the flutter in her chest, nodding permission for Alexander to be shown in. He entered with raindrops still clinging to his greatcoat, his usually perfect appearance slightly dishevelled as though he had come in haste, and the formal words she had prepared died on her lips when she saw the raw vulnerability in his grey eyes as he stood before her desk like a supplicant rather than a peer of the realm. "Miss Ashford, forgive the intrusion, but I could not let another day pass without speaking truthfully," he began, his voice lacking its usual assured command, and Margaret gestured to the chair across from her desk, watching as he sat and seemed to gather his thoughts while the rain intensified outside. "You thanked me for standing by you at the opera, but you do not understand that it is I who should be grateful," he continued, running a hand through his damp hair in an uncharacteristically nervous gesture. "For you have shown me what true courage looks like, maintaining your dignity and grace while society attempted to destroy you with lies, and I find myself humbled by your strength." Margaret felt tears prick her eyes, but kept her voice steady as she replied, "Your Grace, you sacrificed your social standing for someone who began as merely an annoyance to you, and I hardly think that required less courage." But he shook his head emphatically, leaning forward with an intensity that made her breath catch. "You do not understand. I have spent years wearing a mask of perfect propriety while my family's fortune crumbled, pretending that the Westford name and estates were not built on generations of debt and poor management, maintaining a facade while creditors circled like vultures," he confessed, and Margaret saw his hands tremble slightly as he continued. "But you have built something real through honest work and intelligence, creating wealth where there was none, and society punishes you for the very accomplishments they praise in men." Without conscious thought, Margaret reached across the desk and placed her hand over his trembling fingers, feeling the shock of warm skin against her own as she said softly, "Then perhaps we understand each other better than most, Your Grace. For we both know the weight of expectations and the price of maintaining appearances." And as his fingers turned to intertwine with hers, she felt the first crack in the walls they had both built around their hearts, knowing that whatever happened next would change them both irrevocably. The morning of May 15th, 1815, dawned bright and clear exactly 1 month after the ball that had irrevocably altered the course of both their lives, and Margaret Ashford found herself standing before her mirror, adjusting a new bonnet of cream silk adorned with pale pink roses, her hands trembling slightly as she prepared for her morning ride in Hyde Park, knowing that Alexander would be waiting by the Serpentine, as he had every morning since their moment of truth in her study 5 days prior. The transformation in their relationship had been as swift as it was profound, moving from that first tentative touch of hands to a courtship conducted under the watchful eyes of all London society, and Margaret felt both exhilarated and terrified by the intensity of emotions that Alexander stirred within her with each carefully proper public encounter that hinted at deeper feelings beneath the surface. He was there when she arrived, mounted on his black stallion and cutting a magnificent figure in his bottle-green riding coat, and the smile that lit his features when he spotted her carriage made her heart skip in a way that would have seemed impossible just weeks ago, when he had been merely the proud Duke who had mocked her dowry. "Miss Ashford, you grow lovelier each day," he said, as he dismounted to help her from the carriage, his gloved fingers holding hers perhaps a moment longer than strictly necessary, and she felt the now familiar warmth spread through her at his touch, though they both maintained perfect propriety under the interested gazes of other early morning riders. They rode side by side along the carefully groomed paths, their horses matching pace as naturally as their conversation flowed, discussing everything from her latest property acquisition in Bloomsbury to his plans for modernizing the Westford estates, and Margaret marveled at how comfortable she had become in his presence, how his initial arrogance had given way to genuine interest in her thoughts and opinions. Later that afternoon, she encountered him again at Hatchard's bookshop on Piccadilly, where he just happened to be browsing the same section of financial texts that had drawn her attention, and when he quietly purchased the expensive volume she had been admiring, and had it sent to her house with a note that simply read, "For our future discussions, A," she pressed the card to her heart like a lovesick girl. The evening brought them together once more at Lady Sinclair's musicale, where Alexander manoeuvred the seating arrangements so expertly that Margaret found herself beside him for the entire performance, and during a particularly moving sonata, she felt him shift slightly closer, the warmth of his presence a comfort that she had come to crave with alarming intensity. Throughout it all, London society watched and whispered, some with disapproval at the Duke's choice of the merchant's granddaughter, others with grudging admiration for Margaret's poise and the obvious affection growing between the unlikely pair, and even the harshest critics had to admit that the Duke of Westford had never looked happier than he did when gazing at Miss Ashford with barely concealed devotion. As the day drew to a close and Margaret prepared for bed, she found a single white rose on her pillow with another note in Alexander's bold script, "Until tomorrow, dream of me as I dream of you." And she fell asleep clutching the flower, no longer fighting the truth that she was completely, irrevocably in love with the man who had begun as her adversary and become her heart's greatest champion. The afternoon sun cast long shadows through the tall windows of Montague House on May 20th, 1815, exactly 5 weeks after the ball that had changed everything. As Margaret Ashford sat rigidly in the blue drawing-room, awaiting the arrival of the Dowager Duchess of Westford, Alexander's formidable mother, who had arrived in London that very morning after receiving word of her son's shocking courtship, with a merchant's granddaughter. Margaret had dressed with particular care in her finest afternoon gown of deep plum silk, her hair arranged elegantly, knowing that this meeting would determine whether she and Alexander could continue their courtship with any hope of familial blessing, though the flutter of nerves in her stomach suggested she already suspected the outcome. Lady Harriet sat beside her, offering silent support. Having warned Margaret that morning that their mother was in what she delicately termed one of her moods, which Margaret understood to mean the dowager was prepared for battle against the upstart who dared reach for her precious son. The door opened with theatrical precision at exactly 3 o'clock, and the Dowager Duchess swept in like an avenging angel in black bombazine, her steel-grey hair severely arranged beneath a formidable cap, her pale blue eyes identical to Alexander's, but holding none of his warmth as they surveyed Margaret with the calculating coldness of a general assessing enemy fortifications. "So you are the creature who has ensnared my son," the dowager announced without preamble or courtesy, settling into her chair with regal disdain, while Margaret rose to curtsy. Maintaining her composure despite the deliberate insult in being called a creature rather than a lady. "Your Grace, I am honored to make your acquaintance," Margaret replied with perfect propriety, resuming her seat with a dignity that seemed to irritate the older woman further. And beside her, Harriet shifted uncomfortably at the palpable tension filling the elegant room. "Honored, are you? I suppose you consider yourself quite clever, revealing your fortune at precisely the moment to capture a duke's attention when he had already dismissed you as beneath notice," the dowager continued, her voice dripping with contempt as she poured tea with movements so precise they seemed weaponized. Margaret felt heat rise in her cheeks, but kept her voice level as she responded. "I revealed nothing to capture anyone, Your Grace. Merely to defend myself against public mockery, and if Alexander has chosen to pursue an acquaintance afterward, that was entirely his decision, not some scheme of mine." The dowager's laugh was sharp as breaking glass as she set down her teacup with a decisive click, leaning forward to deliver what she clearly considered a killing blow. "My dear girl, you may have money, mountains of it if the gossips are to be believed, but you will never have breeding, never have the centuries of noble blood that make a true duchess, and I will never accept a tradesman's granddaughter as my son's wife, no matter how many buildings you own in this cesspool of a city." The silence that followed was deafening until Margaret rose slowly to her feet, drawing on every ounce of dignity her grandfather had taught her as she looked the dowager directly in the eye and said quietly but firmly, "Then it is fortunate, Your Grace, that your son is a grown man capable of making his own choices, and that I care far more for his good opinion than yours," before sweeping from the room with Harriet hurrying after her, leaving the Dowager Duchess temporarily speechless in her wake. The evening of May 25th, 1815 had fallen with unseasonable chill over London, 6 weeks after the fateful ball, as Margaret Ashford sat in the dimly lit offices of Fleming and Associates, her usually composed features drawn with worry as she reviewed the devastating documents spread before her. A coordinated attack on her property holdings that threatened to destroy everything her grandfather had built unless she could raise an enormous sum within 48 hours. The gaslight flickered across Thomas Fleming's grave face as he explained how several of her largest tenants had mysteriously broken their leases simultaneously, clearly orchestrated by someone with both influence and malicious intent, and Margaret felt her heart sink as she recognized the hand of Lord Pembroke, Catherine's father, who had never forgiven her for overshadowing his daughter. The door burst open at 9:30, and Alexander strode in without ceremony, his evening clothes still damp from the rain, his face set in lines of determination as he announced, "I heard at the club what Pembroke is attempting, and I came immediately," his eyes seeking Margaret's with an intensity that made her breath catch, despite the crisis surrounding them. "Your Grace, this is a private business matter," Fleming began formally, But Alexander cut him off with an imperious wave, moving to stand behind Margaret's chair as he demanded to know the full extent of the threat, his presence solid and reassuring, even as she tried to maintain her independence in the face of disaster. The sum required was staggering. £50,000 needed immediately to cover the lost rents and legal fees to fight the coordinated breach of contracts. And Margaret felt tears prick her eyes for the first time since her grandfather's death, as she realized she would have to liquidate prime properties at a devastating loss to raise such capital so quickly. "I can provide the funds," Alexander said quietly, reaching into his coat to produce a banker's draft. But Margaret shook her head vehemently, rising from her chair to face him as she declared, "I cannot accept your money, not like this, not when you have not even—" But she could not finish the sentence about their undeclared feelings. "Then accept it as a business arrangement," he proposed, his voice steady, but his eyes betraying deeper emotions as he continued. "A loan at standard interest rates, with your Mayfair properties as collateral, though God knows I would give you everything I possess, without conditions if you would allow it." And the raw honesty in his tone made her heart constrict. Fleming discreetly withdrew to give them privacy, as Margaret turned to the window. Watching the rain streak down the glass as she wrestled with her pride, knowing that accepting Alexander's help would irrevocably change the dynamic between them, yet knowing too that refusing would mean losing everything her grandfather had entrusted to her. "Why would you risk such a sum on someone your mother considers beneath you?" she asked softly, and she heard him move closer, his reflection appearing beside hers in the window as he replied with quiet fervor. "Because I have come to understand that you are worth more than all the titles and bloodlines in England, because your strength and intelligence humble me daily, and because the thought of anyone bringing you low makes me want to call out every man involved," his hands clenching at his sides with barely restrained fury. She turned to face him then, seeing in his eyes not the proud Duke who had once mocked her, but a man who had learned to value what truly mattered. And with trembling hands she accepted the draft, whispering, "I will repay every penny with interest," to which he responded with a sad smile. "I know you will, for you are too proud to accept what I would freely give. But perhaps someday you will allow me to share your burdens as more than merely your banker," the hope in his voice making her realize that he too was waiting for the right moment to speak what was in both their hearts. The golden light of sunset on May 30th, 1815, painted the rose garden of Margaret Ashford's townhouse in hues of amber and coral, exactly 7 weeks after that fateful ball where everything had begun, as Margaret stood among the blooming flowers trying to calm her racing heart. Knowing that Alexander had asked to meet her here privately after successfully resolving the crisis that had threatened to destroy her inheritance. She heard his footsteps on the gravel path before she saw him, and when she turned, the sight of him in the dying light made her breath catch. For gone was any trace of the proud Duke who had once dismissed her so cruelly, replaced by a man whose eyes held such tender reverence that she felt tears threaten despite her determination to maintain composure. "The contracts are all secured," he said quietly as he approached, stopping at a proper distance though she could see the effort it cost him. "Pembroke has withdrawn his attack entirely. Faced with the combined force of your brilliant legal strategy and what I confess was some rather unducal threatening on my part," and the wry smile that accompanied this admission made her heart flutter dangerously. "We make rather a formidable team," Margaret replied, her voice not quite steady, as she fingered the velvet petals of a damask rose, aware that something momentous hung in the perfumed air between them, something that had been building through all these weeks of partnership and growing understanding. Alexander took a step closer, his voice dropping to that intimate register she had come to treasure, as he said, "Margaret, I must speak, though I fear I have lost all right to your regard through my initial blindness and cruelty." And she saw his hands clench and unclench at his sides as he struggled with words that had never come easily to a man raised to command rather than entreat. "You have more than earned my regard," she whispered, turning to face him fully, as the last rays of sun caught the gold threads in her hair. "Though I confess I never expected to give it to the man who once called me a desperate spinster with delusions of grandeur." And despite the pain of the memory, she found herself able to smile at how far they had traveled from that terrible moment. "I was a fool," he said simply, closing the distance between them until she could see the flecks of gold in his blue eyes. "A blind, arrogant fool who nearly let the greatest treasure in England slip through my fingers because I was too stupid to recognize that true worth has nothing to do with age or beauty or bloodlines, but everything to do with courage and intelligence and integrity, all of which you possess in measures that humble me daily." The roses around them seemed to hold their breath as Alexander slowly sank to one knee on the garden path, producing a ring that caught the dying light with ancient fire as he looked up at her with an expression of such vulnerable hope that her tears finally spilled over, and his voice was rough with emotion as he said, "Margaret Ashford, you who own half of London and all of my heart, will you do me the incredible honor of becoming my Duchess, not for your fortune or for society's sake, but because I love you with every fiber of my being and cannot imagine a life without your brilliant mind and generous heart beside me?" The question hung in the rose-scented air for a heartbeat before Margaret sank down to join him on the path, not caring about her silk gown as she took his face between her hands and whispered, "Yes, Alexander, yes, though I warn you that I am still a managing female with strong opinions about everything from tenant rights to agricultural improvements." And his laugh was pure joy as he slipped the ring onto her finger before pulling her into an embrace that was everything proper society would condemn and everything her heart had secretly yearned for through these weeks of cautious dancing around their feelings. The glittering ballroom at Montague House blazed with the light of 1,000 candles on the evening of June 5th, 1815, exactly 2 months after that first fateful ball, as Margaret Ashford stood at the top of the grand staircase in a gown of liquid gold that caught every flame and transformed her into something ethereal, her hand resting lightly on Alexander's arm as they prepared to face the cream of London society, who had assembled for what they believed would be a typical early summer entertainment. The transformation in her appearance was remarkable, not because she had suddenly become beautiful by society's narrow standards, but because happiness and confidence had illuminated her from within, making her brown eyes sparkle with anticipation rather than resignation. Her shoulders straight with the knowledge that she was loved and valued for exactly who she was, not who she might pretend to be. Alexander stood beside her in evening dress of midnight blue, his expression one of unmistakable pride as he gazed down at his betrothed, and when he spoke, his voice carried both tenderness and steel as he said, "Ready to shock them all one more time, my darling?" To which she replied with a smile that would have stunned those who had known her as a wallflower. "I believe, Your Grace, that we have become rather expert at delivering surprises to the ton." And the shared amusement in their eyes spoke of private jokes and intimate understanding. The ballroom below them hummed with speculation, for while rumors of their engagement had circulated for days, no official announcement had been made. And Margaret could see Catherine holding court near the refreshment table, her beautiful face pinched with barely concealed fury, as she attempted to convince anyone who would listen that her cousin had somehow entrapped the Duke through nefarious means. Lady Harriet appeared at the bottom of the stairs, resplendent in rose silk, her face alight with genuine joy as she called up, "Brother Margaret, they are all waiting with bated breath, and I must confess I am enjoying their suspense immensely." Her transformation from polite acquaintance to fierce advocate for their union, one of the unexpected joys of these past weeks. As they descended the stairs together, Margaret felt the weight of hundreds of eyes upon them, heard the whispers rise like a tide, but instead of the old familiar anxiety, she felt only a calm certainty that she belonged here, not because of her fortune or even because of Alexander's title, but because she had learned to value herself as he valued her, as a woman of intelligence, integrity, and worth beyond any material measure. The music ceased as they reached the ballroom floor, and Alexander raised his hand for silence, his voice carrying to every corner of the magnificent room as he announced, "Ladies and gentlemen, I have the great honor and even greater joy to announce my engagement to Miss Margaret Ashford, who has consented to become my Duchess, and more importantly, my partner in all things." And the emphasis he placed on partner was not lost on those who understood that this was no mere society match, but a union of equals. The reaction was immediate and varied, ranging from genuine congratulations from those who had come to know and respect Margaret, to barely concealed shock from those who still could not fathom how a merchant's granddaughter had captured a duke, to outright dismay from the matchmaking mothers who had hoped to snare him for their own daughters. But through it all, Margaret stood tall, her hand firmly clasped in Alexander's, feeling the solid reality of his presence beside her like an anchor in a storm. The morning sun of June 15th, 1815, streamed through the windows of the morning room at Montague House, as Margaret sat surrounded by fabric samples, invitation lists, and menu cards, exactly 10 days before her wedding. Trying to maintain her composure while the Dowager Duchess of Westford examined a piece of Belgian lace with the intensity of a general planning a military campaign. And though their relationship had begun with icy disapproval, something had shifted in these past days, as the older woman had come to recognize that her son's happiness was genuine and profound. "This lace is adequate, I suppose," the Dowager announced, though Margaret caught the slight softening around her eyes that she had learned to recognize as approval, though I still maintain that Honiton would have been more appropriate for a future duchess. But the criticism lacked its former sting, and when Margaret replied, "I defer to your superior knowledge, Your Grace, though I confess I chose Belgian for sentimental reasons, as my grandfather imported it for my mother's wedding," she saw something like understanding flash across her future mother-in-law's aristocratic features. Lady Harriet burst into the room like a whirlwind of excitement, her arms full of ribbon samples, exclaiming, "Margaret, you must see these silk ribbons I found for the bridesmaids' bouquets. They match the rose theme perfectly." And her enthusiasm was so infectious that even the Dowager's lips twitched in what might have been the beginning of a smile, especially when Harriet added, "Mother, you were absolutely right about the florist on Bond Street. He has agreed to provide white roses from his hothouse, despite the season." The heat of approaching summer made itself felt even in the cool morning room, and Margaret found herself grateful for the lighter fabrics she had chosen for her trousseau, a practical decision that had initially earned the Dowager's disdain, until Alexander had quietly mentioned that his bride's comfort mattered more to him than adherence to tradition. A statement that had rendered his formidable mother temporarily speechless. "Speaking of flowers," the Dowager said, setting aside the lace with deliberate care, "I have taken the liberty of sending a note to the Archbishop about the placement of the arrangements in the church, as the current plan would obscure the Montague family pew." And though her tone was imperious, Margaret recognized this involvement for what it was, an acceptance of her place in the family, and she responded with genuine gratitude. "Thank you, Your Grace. I would be lost without your guidance in these matters." Words that were more true than she might have admitted weeks ago. The sound of masculine voices in the hall announced Alexander's arrival with Mr. Fleming, who had been assisting with the marriage settlement details, and when her betrothed entered the room, his face lighting up at the sight of her, Margaret felt that familiar flutter in her chest that no amount of wedding planning stress could diminish, especially when he crossed directly to her side, propriety be damned, to drop a kiss on her hand while murmuring, "My darling, you look lovelier every day, though I suspect my mother has been tormenting you with details about precedence and protocol," his knowing look encompassing both his mother's managing nature and Margaret's patient forbearance. The golden sunlight of midsummer morning streamed through the stained glass windows of St. George's, Hanover Square, on June 25, 1815, casting jewelled patterns across the stone floor where Margaret Ashford stood in the vestry, her hands trembling slightly as Lady Harriet adjusted the Belgian lace veil that fell from her carefully arranged hair, while outside the church bells began their joyous pealing to announce that the wedding of the season was about to commence. She wore a gown of ivory silk that had been her mother's, lovingly altered by the finest modiste in London to suit current fashion while maintaining its sentimental value, the delicate embroidery at the hem catching the light as she moved. And around her throat lay the Montague pearls that the Dowager Duchess had presented to her just that morning, with unexpected tears in her eyes, saying, "These have been worn by every Duchess of Westford for 3 centuries, and I can think of no one more worthy to bear them next." The sound of organ music drifting from the sanctuary made Margaret's heart race, and Harriet squeezed her hand with sisterly affection, whispering, "Alexander is already at the altar, and I have never seen him look so happy, though he did ask me to tell you that if you have changed your mind, he will personally fight anyone who tries to stop you from leaving," which made Margaret laugh despite her nerves, knowing that he meant every word even as he knew she would never run. Mr. Fleming appeared at the vestry door, his usually stern face softened with paternal pride as he offered her his arm, having agreed to give her away in place of the father she had lost so young, and he patted her hand gently as he said, "Your grandfather would be so proud to see you today, my dear, not just for the match you have made, but for the woman you have become." Words that brought tears to her eyes that she hastily blinked away. The great doors of the sanctuary opened, and Margaret saw the church packed with the highest echelons of society, including many who had whispered behind their fans about her just months ago, but her gaze went immediately to the altar, where Alexander stood waiting in his dress uniform, his face transformed by an expression of such profound love and wonder that everything else faded into insignificance. As she began her walk down the aisle, the whispers rose around her like wind through leaves, but now they spoke of her dignity, her fortune, her remarkable capture of the most eligible duke in England, though she cared nothing for their opinions anymore, her entire focus on the man whose eyes never left hers, whose smile grew wider with each step that brought her closer to becoming his wife. The Archbishop of Canterbury himself presided over the ceremony, his sonorous voice filling the sacred space as he spoke the ancient words that would bind them together, and when Alexander took her hand to slip the gold band onto her finger, she felt the slight tremor in his touch that revealed his own deep emotion despite his composed exterior, especially when he spoke his vows with a clarity and conviction that left no doubt in anyone's mind that this was a love match of the truest kind. The evening shadows lengthened across the master suite of Montague House on June 25, 1815, as Margaret stood before the tall windows overlooking the garden, still wearing her wedding gown, though the elaborate veil now lay carefully folded on the nearby chair, her fingers touching the gold band that proclaimed her the new Duchess of Westford, while behind her she heard Alexander dismissing his valet with quiet words, creating the privacy that would allow them to truly be alone for the first time as husband and wife. The sounds of departing wedding guests drifted up from the drive below, their carriages clattering away into the London night, after the elaborate wedding breakfast that had lasted well into the evening, and she smiled softly, remembering how Alexander had never left her side throughout the endless receiving line, his hand finding hers whenever possible, offering silent support when Great-Aunt Prudence had made cutting remarks about merchants' granddaughters rising above their station. "You are too far away, my darling wife." Alexander's voice came warm and tender as his arms encircled her from behind, drawing her back against his chest where she could feel the steady beating of his heart through the fine linen of his shirt, and she leaned into his embrace with a sigh of contentment, marveling at how natural it felt to be held by him despite the fact that such intimacy would have been unthinkable just hours before. "I was thinking," she said softly, her voice carrying a note of wonder, "that 2 months ago I stood in a ballroom certain I would die a spinster, mocked and overlooked, and now here I am in your arms, your duchess, your wife." And she felt him press a kiss to her temple as he replied, "And I was a fool who nearly let pride and prejudice blind me to the greatest treasure I could ever find, though I thank God every day that your magnificent defiance that night opened my eyes to what truly matters." She turned in his arms to face him, her hands coming up to frame his beloved face as she studied the features she had come to know so well during their whirlwind courtship. The strong jaw that could set so stubbornly when he was defending her honor, the eyes that could flash with anger at society's cruelties, or soften with such tenderness when they looked at her, the mouth that had spoken vows just hours ago that had made her heart soar with their sincerity and devotion. "I love you, Alexander," she whispered, the words still feeling new and precious on her lips. "Not because you are a duke, not because you defended me when others would have scorned me, but because you saw me, truly saw me, when I had grown accustomed to being invisible." And his response was to capture her lips in a kiss that was different from the chaste touches they had shared before, deeper and full of promise. Speaking of all the years they would have to explore this connection between them that transcended mere physical attraction to encompass a true partnership of minds and hearts and souls united in purpose and devotion. The crisp autumn morning of September 1st, 1815, found Margaret Montague, Duchess of Westford, seated at the elegant mahogany desk in the morning room of Westford House, reviewing architectural plans for the renovation of the East Wing, while her husband Alexander stood behind her chair, his hand resting gently on her shoulder as they discussed the improvements that their joint business ventures had made possible, when she suddenly pressed her fingers to her lips and rose hastily from her seat, causing him to look at her with immediate concern. "Margaret, my darling, are you unwell?" he asked, moving to steady her as she swayed slightly, her face pale beneath the soft morning light that filtered through the tall windows overlooking the garden where the leaves were just beginning to turn gold and crimson, and she managed a tremulous smile as she replied, "Not unwell, my love, but I believe I must speak with Dr. Harrison soon, for I suspect that our partnership is about to expand in a way that has nothing to do with property holdings or merchant ventures." The realization dawned in his eyes, like sunrise breaking over the horizon, and he gathered her into his arms with such tender care that tears sprang to her eyes, hearing him whisper against her hair, "A child, our child," with such wonder and joy that she could only nod, overwhelmed by the emotion of the moment and the way he held her as if she were made of the finest porcelain, though she had never felt stronger or more certain of her place in the world than she did as his wife, and now the future mother of his heir. "I suspected last week," she admitted softly, "when certain signs became apparent, but I wanted to be sure before I told you, especially with all the work we have been doing to consolidate the Scottish properties with the London holdings, though I suppose we shall need to make additional renovations now, perhaps turning the Blue Room into a nursery." and she felt him laugh against her shoulder, the sound rich with happiness as he said, "My brilliant wife, always thinking ahead, though I confess my mind is rather too full of joy at this moment to contemplate anything beyond the miracle you have just shared with me." The morning-room door opened to admit Harriet, who took one look at their embracing figures, and her brother's expression of transcendent happiness before exclaiming, "Oh, Margaret, is it true? Are you—that is, shall I be an aunt?" And at Margaret's smiling nod, she flew across the room to embrace them both, chattering excitedly about tiny clothes and nursery decorations, and how the Dowager Duchess would be beside herself with delight at the prospect of a grandchild to spoil, creating such a warm tableau of family joy that Margaret felt her heart might burst with the fullness of it all, remembering how just months ago she had stood alone in ballrooms, invisible and overlooked, never dreaming that she would find herself at the center of such love and acceptance, carrying within her the future of a dynasty that would be built on partnership, respect, and genuine affection rather than mere bloodlines and tradition. The grand ballroom of Almack's glittered with Christmas finery on the evening of December 20th, 1815, as Margaret Montague, Duchess of Westford, entered on her husband's arm, her emerald velvet gown cleverly cut to accommodate her advanced pregnancy, while still maintaining an air of elegance that drew every eye in the room, though she noticed with quiet satisfaction that the whispers following in their wake now held notes of respect and even envy rather than the mockery she had once endured in these same hallowed halls. "The Duchess of Westford looks positively radiant," she heard Lady Jersey murmur to Princess Esterhazy as they passed. "And they say the Duke absolutely dotes on her, refuses to attend any function where she might be made uncomfortable," which made Alexander's arm tighten protectively around hers as he guided her toward a comfortable chair near the refreshment table, his solicitude touching her heart even as she assured him she felt perfectly well, the child within her seeming to respond to the music, with gentle movements that made her smile. Across the room she spotted Lady Catherine Beaumont, her cousin who had once dismissed her as hopelessly on the shelf, now married to a baronet whose gambling debts were common knowledge among the ton. And Margaret felt not triumph but a gentle pity as she observed Catherine's pinched expression and the way she watched the Duke and Duchess with barely concealed jealousy, remembering how desperately Catherine had pursued Alexander just months ago. "Your Grace," came a familiar, unwelcome voice, and Margaret turned to find Lady Pembroke approaching, the same woman whose ball had witnessed both her greatest humiliation and the beginning of her transformation. "How wonderful to see you back in London for the season, and may I say you look absolutely blooming, though I suppose we should not be surprised given how well-suited you and the Duke have proved to be," the words carrying an undertone of frustrated disappointment that her initial prediction of disaster had proved so thoroughly wrong. Margaret inclined her head graciously, feeling Alexander's protective presence beside her as she replied, "How kind of you to say so, Lady Pembroke, and how festive Almack's looks this evening, though I confess nothing could compare to the decorations we have arranged at Westford House for the children's charity event next week, where we shall be distributing gifts and winter provisions to over 300 families from the parishes surrounding our London properties." Watching with satisfaction as Lady Pembroke's eyes widened at this reminder of the vast holdings Margaret commanded. "My wife has revolutionized the management of our estates," Alexander added with pride that warmed Margaret to her toes, "implementing educational programs and health initiatives that have increased both productivity and tenant satisfaction remarkably, though I suppose I should not be surprised by the business acumen of a woman who owns half of London." His deliberate echo of her famous declaration drawing titters from nearby listeners, and a flush to Lady Pembroke's cheeks as she remembered her own cutting remarks about Margaret's supposed lack of dowry. The spring afternoon of April 15th, 1820, found Margaret Montague, Duchess of Westford, standing in the nursery of Westford House, watching her 3 children play in the dappled sunlight that streamed through the tall windows. 5 years to the day since she had stood in Lady Pembroke's ballroom and spoken the words that had changed her life forever. And as she observed young William, age 4, helping his sister Eleanor, age 2, stack wooden blocks, while baby James gurgled happily in his cradle, she reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought her from lonely spinster to beloved wife, mother, and one of the most influential women in London society. Alexander entered quietly behind her, his arms encircling her waist as he rested his chin on her shoulder, whispering, "Happy anniversary of your rebellion, my darling." For they had made it their private tradition to celebrate this date alongside their wedding anniversary, recognizing it as the moment when everything had begun to change, when she had found the courage to speak her truth and demand recognition for who she truly was beneath society's dismissive labels. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked softly, leaning back into his embrace as Eleanor toddled over to show them her tower. The way it all began, with such drama and defiance. And she felt him smile against her neck as he replied, "How could I regret the moment that brought me the greatest treasure of my life, not your vast properties, my love, but you yourself, the woman who taught me that true worth has nothing to do with age or beauty or conventional expectations, but everything to do with character, intelligence, and the courage to stand up and declare one's value to the world." The children's governess entered to take them for their afternoon walk in the garden, and as Margaret and Alexander made their way to the study where they conducted their joint business ventures, she paused at the window overlooking Grosvenor Square, remembering how she had once walked these streets feeling invisible, overlooked, dismissed as a failure simply because she had passed the arbitrary age that society deemed acceptable for marriage, never knowing that her grandfather's legacy would provide not just wealth, but the key to finding someone who could see her true worth. "We have done well, have we not?" Alexander said, gesturing to the maps and documents spread across the desk that detailed their expanded holdings, the schools they had founded, the housing improvements they had implemented, the lives they had touched through their partnership. And Margaret nodded, knowing he spoke not just of business, but of the life they had built together, the love that had grown deeper with each passing year, the family they had created, the example they had set for others who might also be dismissed or overlooked by society's narrow definitions of value. My dear friends, if you have stayed with me through this tale, perhaps you too have felt the sting of being overlooked, undervalued, or dismissed. Perhaps you too have wondered if your moment will ever come, if anyone will ever see past the surface to the treasure within you. And I tell you now, with all the wisdom these years have brought, your worth is not determined by others' opinions. Your value does not diminish with age or circumstance. And sometimes the greatest act of courage is simply to speak your truth, to declare who you are and what you possess, whether that be property, talent, wisdom, or simply a heart ready to love and be loved in return. For you never know who might be listening, ready to see you truly for the first time, ready to begin a journey that could transform both your lives in ways you never dared imagine.